Hi, and welcome to the next presentation of the information processing model for EdTech 566. This presentation is going to be about elaboration and organization of long-term memory. Now, the last time we left off, we had created this mental model to represent information processing. And what we're going to do this time is focus our attention on the transition from working memory into long-term memory and think about the organization of long-term memory. So here's what we're going to try to accomplish in this particular session. Remember that we're trying to develop an intuitive mental model. So we'll let it up to the textbooks to present the theoretical arguments and the experimental evidence to support these different pieces of the models. And my objective for doing these presentations is to contextualize them in something that makes intuitive sense. So that's what I'm going to be trying to do, help to build the intuitive part of your mental model for learning. So this time we want to work on how we think about long-term memory. And we want to think about it as an associational network. And what I'm going to try to do is present some examples and arguments that makes that seem to make sense for us. And then we're going to talk about ways of creating these associational networks in long-term memory. And these are going to be called elaboration and organization processes. And finally, we want to be able to recognize that structuring long-term memory is an essential process for supporting recall of information. So the better structured long-term memory is, the more easily it's going to be to recall information. So if we go back to our information processing model, as I said, today we're going to focus on this particular area, the working memory and the interface between working memory and long-term memory, and that's where encoding and recall take place. So here's where we are right now. And again, keeping with this intuitive theme, what I would like to do is present an example to show how long-term memory can be viewed as associational. In other words, that we can think of information in one point of long-term memory as being connected to information in another point of long-term memory. And so I did a little thought activity to demonstrate this, and for this particular thought activity, I just picked the term conference. And I first did this activity as I was preparing for a conference. So this is how this particular topic came about. And you can do this with any topic that you like, and you'll get a similar result. So what I did is I just sat down in a quiet room in a comfortable chair, and with a way to record quick notes, and I just sat down and I did free association. So I started with the thought conference and then tried to free associate what came to mind next as I thought about conference. And here's what happened. As I thought about the conference, the next thing that came to mind was the type of conference that I would be attending. So in Pennsylvania, we have the PETE&C, that's the Educational Technology Conference and Expo. The professional organization for learning designers is AECT, the Association for Information Communications and Technology. You may be familiar with ISTE. But that's what came to my mind in terms of type of sponsor, so the type of conference that I was going to be attending. So once I thought of that, two things came to mind, and actually you can see that in a way my network hasn't changed very much, because I described AECT as a scholarly conference and Pete and C is a practitioner conference, so that you can see from the time I originally made this did this free association to now talking about it at a later time. I'm still my memory is still kind of connected in a very similar way. So I had in working memory scholarly conference, practitioner conferences, and the next thing that came to mind was that, well, here I go again. I'm My mind is showing that it's still kind of organized the same way. AECT and AERA is the American Education Research Association are examples of scholarly conferences, and I have Pete and C here as an example of a practitioner conference. So typically AERA will be held, and AECT will be held in different cities each year, and that was where my mind led me next. So I went from the sponsor scholarly conferences, AECT and AERA, to cities, and then once I started thinking about cities, I started to think about how do we get to the cities and different types of travel. Most times, you don't get to drive to a national conference because the closest are usually held, well, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. are probably the most drivable of these, but they don't hit there very often. So from types of travel, though, you can see that that links up with conferences again. Next thing that I thought of when I thought of types of travel was traveling by car. And again, I'm demonstrating that I still think pretty much this way because of the way I talk about it. Because when I talked to you about types of travel, I talked about air travel and cars and drivable conferences. And as soon as I thought about drivable conferences, that took me back to Pete and C, because Pete and C is always held in Hershey, PA, which is always drivable. So you can see how thinking about one thing kind of leads you around and brings you back to another place in my memory just through a free association. And notice I have another link in here, air travel, and it's usually the scholarly conferences that require air travel, which I also just demonstrated by the way I talk about it, because I talked about flying to the national conferences. And here's another one. So this was the next free association that I made, was that sometimes you can drive to scholarly conferences, and I already talked about that. So you can see that the basic connections in my long-term memory that caused me to make these nodes and arrows just through free association are still fairly structured in the same way in my long-term memory, just by how I talk about this. Okay, here's a next thing that came to mind as I was thinking about conferences, and this time I went back to the original theme. Now, not deliberately, but like I said, I was just doing this through free association. But the next thing that I associated with conference was doing presentations at conferences, and continuing out from there, the preparation for the presentation, the reservations, what was needed for the presentations, and that brings me back to another link directly from conferences to reservations. Reservations leads me to hotel, and reservations leads me to a lot of other things. If I start thinking about conference and then reservation, I can start thinking about hotels. I can start thinking about making airplane reservations, reservations in different cities. So if I start with conferences and go to reservations and continue to free associate, I get a lot of different things rather quickly just because reservations can have so many different meanings while I'm thinking about that. Uh, and when I started thinking about air travel, the next thing that I free associated happened to be California because at that particular time my daughter was living in California and we used to fly out there to see her quite a bit. And if you talked about an airplane, that was the first thing that came to my mind. But the point is that this kind of a network was the result of me just sitting down and doing a free association, starting with the term conference. And like I said, you could do the same thing. You could pick a topic, sit in a quiet place, and just free associate, and you would come up with a network very similar to that. And the whole point is that I want to demonstrate, again, intuitively, that there's something about the organization of our long-term memories that makes it represented as an interconnected network of ideas, a network of idea units. And so when you think about long-term memory, one way that you can visualize it could be something like this, where you have these ideas that are connected all over the place to each other. And what that means is, if you can get to this place in your memory network, just like I was doing with free association, any place that's connected to it, you should be able to get from that place to another place. So you should be able to bounce around this long-term memory using the connections that are available in long-term memory. Okay, here's another example, and I did another free association, but this time I used the software Inspiration. And I did a free association again, but this time I started with the word banana. And I free associated banana, and one train of thought took me up in this direction, yellow. And from yellow, for some reason, I went from yellow to school buses, and so from school buses to students, and students to schools, and then from schools to school boards. And then in another free association, I went that yellow is a color, and blue and green and red are other examples of colors. And then I took banana, and I also free associated banana to be a fruit. And from there, I free associated food, coconut, tropical islands. Well, from coconuts, I free associated the tropical islands. And to different kinds of plums, I have apples and plums. But notice when I free associated over to apple, I also free associated over to red. So this would start to demonstrate, just through free association, how things in my mind are hooked up. Coming down this path, fruit, I came to trees, to plants, to living things, and from living things I bounced over to animals. So again, I show this as an example of how you can do free association, but I did this one in Inspiration because I wanted to demonstrate something else to you. There is an inherent structure in these free associations, and what I can do is I can manipulate this network to help to show the structure Okay, so you can see that some things are categories and other things just carry the association off to other places. We could take, actually we could take school as a category and start to build a network that's organized that way. And then we could take colors and we could build a network that looks something like this. And what you can see from this rearrangement, I mean, the links from the free association are all still there. But this time what I've done is I've implied that this information can also be arranged by category. So there are animals, living things can be plants or animals. Plants can include trees. Trees can produce fruits. Fruit is a category of food, but then you could have other categories coming off of food. Then I have different examples of fruits. Then some of these things can be associated to place. Over here we've got a category called color, and then we have examples of different colors, and then we see that colors connect back to some of these other things. The point being, again, that something that I started creating through free association, I also was able to show that there's a hierarchical structure, that the things that are in that free association network can actually be viewed a little bit differently. They can be viewed by category. So from there, what I'd like to do is go to a study that's described in the Ellen Gagne textbook, Collins and Quillian from 1969. And what I did with that, I took a diagram on page 68 of the Ellen Gagne text, and I recreated it in Inspiration, which was the same tool that I just used to move the bananas around. And this is that same network represented in bubbles and arrows rather than the way that it was represented in the textbook. And you can see there's this inherent in structure again. There's animals, then there's a type of animal, bird, then there's a type of types of birds, and there are also characteristics of birds, another type of animal, different specific types within fish, sharks, salmon, etc. Characteristics of all fish, characteristics of all animals. And this particular experiment, what they did is conducted an interesting way of making an inference about how we access information stored in these networks, and information that is stored hierarchically. So the suggestion from this experiment was that we actually do store information hierarchically. And the way they tested this is they started out by timing how long it took somebody to respond true or false to a statement. And the assumption here is that the quicker you can respond, the more closely the information is linked in the network. So you start out with something that's an identity statement, a canary is a canary, and they timed the experimental subjects, the people that they were working with, and came up with, it took 1,000 milliseconds on average to respond to whether that statement was true or false. Okay, the next one, canary is a bird, and you can see that it took a little bit longer, 1175, to respond to that statement to determine whether it was true or false. Here's the next one, canary is an animal, and you can see that it's taking longer, 1240 milliseconds. So suggesting that that's 2 hops away on this network of knowledge. And then finally, a canary is a fish, it goes up to 1430 milliseconds. So they're using those times to make inferences about the structure, the location of these nodes in the memory network. Now they also did, okay, the first set was like is it? So is it a canary? Is a canary a bird? Is a canary an animal? Okay, this next set of statements required some sort of an inference. So a canary can sing, and notice, okay, if you have this as your node for canary, and if this is your nodes for can sing, notice that 1310 milliseconds, it takes a little bit longer to do an inference than it does to recognize a true or false statement. Okay, here's the next one. A canary can fly, and it jumps up. Okay, so the nodes through the network, canary, bird, can fly, so birds can fly, so it takes 1390, suggesting that when you ask if a canary can fly, that because it takes longer to recall that you actually have to jump up through the bird node to get over to the can fly node, rather than having a node for canaries flying. If you were accessing the node for canaries flying, the assumption is that the time for analyzing that answer would have been similar to the time that it took to determine that a canary can sing. Okay, here's another one. A canary has skin, and it's clear up to 1470. Okay, animals have skin. And again, if you had all of that information encoded about canaries directly, that canaries have skin, canaries can fly, canaries have feathers, you would expect the recall times, the times to complete those inferences, to be roughly the same, 1310. But here, in order to answer the question, or to evaluate the statement that a canary has skin, it takes 1470 milliseconds, which suggests that you're jumping through several nodes of this memory network before you can make an answer for that. And finally, does a canary have gills? Okay, what happens there is you go to animals and you go to the fish to analyze that question, that inference about canaries having gills and whether or not it's true or false. And you see that it's 1450. So the Collins and Quillian experiment not only provided evidence for the idea that our memories, our long-term memories, are networked, and that there's a hierarchical structure to these to the information that we store in these networks, but it also provides an interesting suggestion that we don't store redundant information when it's not necessary. In other words, we don't need to store the fact that canaries have skin, ostriches have skin, all birds have skin. If we want to know if a canary has skin, we actually go through our network over to characteristics of animals, and since a canary belongs to the category animals, all animals have skin. We search through our memory that way. So not only is it hierarchical, but we tend to store our information in very efficient ways where we don't have to repeat the same information over and over. We can store the information by the most general category that information can be associated with. Okay, so I'm going to start to refer to these organized memory structures as schemas, and so we'll be using that term throughout the course, and I just wanted to mention it now to start to talk about it that way. So we're trying to build our intuitive mental model to demonstrate that information in long-term memory is stored as associations. And also, we're trying to provide both intuitive and experimental evidence to support the idea that there's not only free association to the information we have connected and stored in long-term memory, but also that there's organization. And the Collins and Quillian experiment actually provided evidence of recall passing from node to node to node through the memory network. So that suggests that access to information depends on how well that information is connected to other nodes in our memory. So I thought I'd like to relate an anecdote, something that happened to me. I had a student one day who had some trouble and then became pregnant during a course and had to drop out of a course, and we had to make some arrangements with the graduate school, for her to complete the course. However, one day I'm working, and I work at home more often than I work up at University Park, and I'm working at home, and I get this email from this student, and it has an attachment that's a project, and I open this thing up, and I didn't know what to do with it, because I received it from her. I remembered who she was. However, I wasn't sure what to do with it. And the next day, I was going to University Park, and I was in my office in Keller Building, and so I reopened this email and read it again. And our offices are arranged around like an area where there's a staff assistant sitting outside of all of the offices. And I hollered out to the staff assistant something about this student, and she responded to me. And as soon as she responded to me, I remembered everything about that assignment. And what had happened is that student was in my office when I made the agreement with her about how to complete, her obligations for the course. And interestingly, when she came into the office, the person that I had hollered out to was the same person who had hollered into me from the outer office that this student was here to see me. And it was just having that one association of the context of that student, the staff assistant outside, and sitting in my office, that made me recall the entire conversation that I had with this student, that I had no connection to it while sitting at home. But remember that I said that long-term memory can store episodic information? So episodic information is recall of an event. And episodic information isn't very well connected to anything else. So when I was sitting at home in a different context and just received a byproduct of information from this student, I wasn't able to connect the product that the student had sent to me with the conversation that I had had with the student to make the agreement that this would complete her course requirements. However, when I went to the context where I had the conversation and had a couple of triggers, I was able to connect that episode and access that episode because I had the connections, other connections, the office, the context of the conversation gave me access to that information that was in long-term memory, but I couldn't get at it from my home office where I was reading her email. So the idea is that we link information in long-term memory, but unless we link it to a lot of other information, we don't have many what they call retrieval paths to get at that information and bring it back. I'll give you another personal anecdote. So I live on an old farm, and I like to work outside when I get a chance. And when I do, I have an iPod, and I like to load it up with NPR podcasts. And one of them is Car Talk. If you've ever heard of that show. But so Car Talk are these two guys, and they're kind of funny, and they talk about car problems. And a lot of times, the information that they give is information that I would really like to remember. But the problem is that when I'm listening to it while I'm doing other jobs, I'm listening to it in more of an episodic form. So if you ask me to use the information that I learned from one of the episodes, chances are I won't be able to do it. However, if I listen to an episode that I have listened to before, I will know that I listened to it before, and often I can actually predict what the answer to the question will be about the car problem. So again, I'm trying to make the point here that if it's just episodic, or if it's only encoded in one way, the chances of getting at that information again is going to be slim. So in order to get information that's going to be really useful, we have to do something a little bit different with it than just storing it in episodic form. So to review, we're thinking of information being stored as linked nodes, and these linked networks can be hierarchically represented. And the point that I was trying to make with the anecdotes is that the memory search will go through these networks, and therefore the more links you have to some information, the more paths you will have to be able to access that information and to retrieve it when you need it. So what that suggests to us is that we need to think about learning in terms of constructing new links and building new hierarchies which can provide additional retrieval paths to the information. So our next challenge, and actually a challenge in this course, is to work on developing a systematic approach to constructing knowledge in long-term memory. And then what we're going to try to do is how to construct this knowledge using technology as learning tools. So again, the point of the Car Talk story is that you have to actively process in order to remember something. So if I wanted to remember something from Car Talk, I have to do more than just listen to it. If I want to be able to use the knowledge of Car Talk and apply it to some problem that I might encounter in the future, I would have to do some activity where I connected the lesson from their answer to a question to some problem that I might actually solve, or set up some conditions that would give me access to that information when I was in that situation. It's kind of similar to when I was sitting in my office and the staff assistant hollered into me the same way she hollered into me the day that she introduced that student. She gave me she activated the retrieval path to my entire conversation with that student. If I'm trying to construct knowledge, I need to construct knowledge in a way that's going to connect the new information that I'm learning to the context that I want myself or the learner to be able to access that information when they're in that particular situation. Something we haven't talked about yet is that information needs to be active in working memory in order to be encoded in long-term memory. And what I mean by that is that when you build these links, if you're going to link something that's in working memory to some other information that's stored in long-term memory, you actually have to recall that information from long-term memory into working memory, then actively make the connection between those two bits of information to then re-encode it into long-term memory. And then once you get it encoded, if you can recall one of the bits of information, the link will give you access to the other bit of information. Now, processes. So as you do readings, and we're going to actually have some assignments in 566 where we invest a lot of energy in this actually. Processes for constructing links. They can be described as elaborations and organization. Elaborations are when you connect new information to knowledge that you already have, where you elaborate on it, provide it additional context, make an inference about it, make a conclusion based on it. Those would all be considered elaborations. Organizations is when you actually impose structure on information. And those structures can be semantic, which I implied with the hierarchies. Outlines would be an example of imposing structure on information. But another way is, remember I said you can store information as images? You can impose graphical organization on information as well. So you can use things like graphs, diagrams to embed information, to embed organization or impose organization on information. But the ultimate goal is, as you're teaching, is to get, if you're a math teacher, you want to get the information that they are learning in math class connected to the situations in real life where they would actually, when they are in those situations, they would have those links over to the math skills that they need in order to be successful at whatever problem solving they are engaging in that particular life context. Same if you're teaching chemistry. If you just teach chemistry and chemistry is taught as this isolation of related principles, the information is not going to be that useful unless you help learners build connections from the course content to the actual life situations where you would expect them to activate that course content. So like the call that so-and-so students out here to see you, you need to actually design learning experiences in ways that are going to connect skills to the situations where those skills will be activated so that they can be used. I just want to say a couple more points about the role of working memory. Remember that the capacity is limited. Okay, we said in the previous presentation that you can only hold about 7 plus or minus 2 bits at one time, and that if you don't do something with information in working memory, it's just lost. It falls out because nothing's happening with it. It either needs to be rehearsed or processed in some other way. And it's important to remember too that what I said a few minutes ago, the information in long-term memory must be active in working memory in order to be encoded to link it up. So you can take new information and recall information from long-term memory, link the two together, and then encode them. Or when you're thinking, you can recall information from long-term memory. You can recall other information from long-term memory and make new links with that information and re-encode it and get that information encoded in a different way. Okay, and finally, I suggested this, and the Collins and Quillen experiment suggests this, that if you activate one bit of information in long-term memory, the information that is directly connected to it will also get activated, so that recalling one node will help you to make it much easier for you to recall all of the other nodes that are connected to that. So this is another point for making long-term memory as richly interconnected as possible, because it will give you more access to the information that's in long-term memory. So we're going to continue then. I'm not going to have an exercise specifically related to this presentation because we're going to have a discussion forum exercise where you're going to, after you read about elaborations and organization, we're going to do some specific work with elaboration and organizations based on your teaching strategies.